Okay. All right. How are we doing? Just got to hang in there. It's not going to be quick. It could be miraculously. There could be a cure overnight. Things could happen quickly. But like Boy Scouts, we have to be prepared that it's going to take longer. And people are finding amazing ways to form community and to look out for each other. I'm going to share tomorrow, I believe, a website created by my good friend Mike Schofler, which helps helpers connect with people who need help, right? Elderly people who can't get to the supermarket and run errands, with young people who are willing to do that. Here in LA, there's a beautiful spreadsheet that's been set up, and a lot of the synagogues and other Jewish community institutions have signed up, and there's lots of helpers signing up. But I just heard that somebody in their 70s in Williamsburg, the non-Jewish religious area of Williamsburg, could use help and doesn't have access to a community or to people that could create that help. So, folks, any way that you can get yourself out there, make yourself available to run errands for at-risk people, vulnerable people, the elderly, it's a beautiful mitzvah. Make it happen. And we should be sharing that site that is all about creating those kinds of connections that Mike Schofler created in New Jersey, but hopefully can have national impact. We'll share that tomorrow when it's ready. Let's begin by joining together to pray for the complete and speedy recovery of these people who need a healing. Some of them from corona, others from other conditions. I mean, let's face it, right now it's not a good time to have any kind of illness, whether it's corona or not. It's just a bad time. So we wish that all these people, please God, give them a complete and speedy recovery. Please heal Yehudis bas Lenore, Babet bas Sarah, Yoel ben Babet, Rivka bas Yehudis, Golda bas Shendel, Chaim ben Rose, Chaya Esther bas Sarah, Devorah bas Sarah, Yosef Yitzhak ben Bracha, Charna bas Joan, Daniela bas Rina, Yoel ben Chaya, Yehudis bas Gittel, Chana bas Lubov, Ilan Chaim ben Yael, Menachem Mendel ben Bracha Frida, Shoshana Varda bas Hadassah, Benjamin ben Chana, Chana Leah bas Rachel, Caleb Daniel ben Sarah, Shiva Chana bas Yehudis, Yehoshua ben Rivka Leo, and Carla bas Yehudis. May they all receive the healing that they need, and may it be fast. And let's say amen. Okay. Remember, by the way, folks, there's just a delay in these live broadcasts. So, when I say something, and then you probably see it about 12 seconds after I say it, and then if you comment, it takes longer to close the loop. So I don't always see what people are saying and how they're responding to what I say, but just know that there's a delay in the broadcast for that reason. However, I will try to keep an eye on the comments, and I think Nina might be monitoring from the other room. So if there's something, an important comment or question, maybe she'll interrupt me with that. All right. What are we doing here? We are keeping Torah learning active and active in a dark time and connecting us across the continent. It's a beautiful thing. By us learning Torah and praying together, that really adds in a real way to the healing of the world. It's important that we do this. So let us keep our learning going. We are holding by page 17 of Tractate Shabbos. Right? Gotta be 17. We did 16 yesterday. Okay, good. Had a wrong note in here, my number. Page 17. We're holding by page 17. We're still in chapter 1, and today we'll be finishing up the Gemaras, the commentaries on the fourth Mishna of chapter 1. Recall that this Mishna dealt with 18 decrees that were issued late in the Second Temple period in the attic of Hananiah ben Chizkiah. And there were matters that were of disagreement between Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai 18 matters of disagreement between the academies of Hillel and the academies of Shammai that were resolved on that day and proclaimed throughout the land that this is what Jews will follow. They were mostly fairly technical matters, but we've been exploring them and see what their impact is, and also trying to understand how the sages came to these decrees, because often it had to do with policy, right? We encountered earlier in our journey this idea that even if all the seas were ink and all the reeds in every marsh were quills, and all the people in the world were writing as a scribe, and the whole sky was the page that we were writing on, it would not suffice to capture the mind of the government, right? And meaning that the government has so many policy considerations that affect so many different people, that's very easy to criticize, from our point of view, because normally we criticize in how things affect us, right? But the people making the policy, they affect so many different people, it's not so easy to understand where they're coming from with our limited information. And actually right now I'm not talking about modern times, I'm talking about how our sages came up with these decrees that we are discussing right now. So let's continue. We have the issue of an ox goad. Okay, what is an ox goad? And this is English, not Hebrew. So a goad is like a stick that you use to goad an ox to move forward. So you can imagine a shepherd for sheep, or I guess a cowherd. Somebody who's moving cows along, that they're going to be used for dairy, or they're going to be slaughtered and used for meat. Either way, so he keeps them moving with a stick that he taps the cows on the butt to keep them moving, right, or on their side. So that's an ox goad. And so we have the issue of, let's say that the cowherd is walking down the path and his ox goad is on his shoulder and he kind of turns to the side. And as he does that, his stick passes over a field, right, beside the path. And it turns out that, let's say it's known that that field is one that had a corpse buried in it. It got plowed over. So we don't know where the corpse is. We have to assume that bits of that corpse that were buried in that field, which was then plowed over, can be anywhere in that field. So essentially that entire field has the status of a corpse, right? Of a corpse. And we know that a corpse imparts the severest form of tumah, of ritual impurity. So what happens is when the cowherd turns and his stick passes over that field, so now it becomes impure, right? It contracts tumah by passing over that field, by passing over the corpse. So according to the opinion of Rabbi Yanai, it will contract tumah if it's big enough sort of to receive the tumah. How big is big enough? If it has a circumference of a tefach. So a tefach is like the width of a hand, a palm's breadth. So if the stick has the circumference of a palm's breadth, you can imagine, so it's this much wrapped around the stick. It's really not a very big stick. That's a very real and comprehensible stick. So then it is large enough to sort of receive the tumah and to transmit that tumah, that ritual impurity, to the one who's carrying it, right? So if that cowherd, he's careful to avoid stepping over that field that has a corpse in it, but if he turns and the stick which is on his shoulder goes over the field, so it contracts tumah and it transmits it to him. But if the stick is wider, if it is the width of a hand breadth, right? So this is the hand breadth, the hand's breadth, right? So if the circumference of the stick is equal to this, right? Wrap this around this much distance and wrap it around the stick, so then it can contract the tumah and transmit to the owner, the possessor, the cowherd himself. But if the width of that ox goad is the full hand breadth, so now it's like a stick that's this big, this is quite a substantial stick, then it can impart tumah to anyone who is under the stick at the same time that it is over the corpses. And the principle here is tent, or corpse in a tent tumah. has a different name in Hebrew, but I mean, it translates better, or the phrase sounds better in Hebrew. But this is tumah of the tent, right? That contains a corpse. That's the concept. This is actually a Torah law that if somebody dies in a tent, so there's a corpse in a tent, and you enter that tent while the corpse is in it, then you contract corpse tumah as if you had touched the corpse itself, right? Even if you maintain the 6-foot distance, as it were, which is not, that's not really a measurement that matters in Torah law for this purpose. The 6-foot distance does matter. We'll get to that a little later. But even if you didn't touch the corpse, if you were in a tent with it, you would contract it. Originally, that law was meant to just be a tent, like if you're inside a tent with the corpse. But over time, the sages really expanded that if you're under a roof, with the corpse, even the roof doesn't have the sides of a tent, you can contract that tumah. And now in one of these decrees, it was extended, per the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, that if you're under a stick at the same time that it's over a corpse and it's over you, you contract that corpse in a tent tumah, ritual impurity, so long as the stick has a width of a hand breadth. That's per the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. That's it for the ox goad. We move on. A person is gathering grapes, so let's say he owns a vineyard, and he's gathering grapes for the purpose of taking them to the wine press, and he's going to make wine out of them. While the grapes are gathered in a vessel that he's going to use to carry the grapes to the wine press, imagine a basket, let's say some liquid, because the grapes, you put enough grapes in the basket, okay, so the grapes at the bottom are going to be smushed a little bit, and some liquid is going to emerge from those grapes, basically grape juice, raw grape juice. And so then the question is, does that raw grape juice that gets squeezed out of the grapes at the bottom of the basket prepare the grapes for tumah? So to understand this question, we have to understand this principle that foods, in order to become impure, in order to contract tumah, they need to be prepared for tumah. And so here we have a principle that, generally speaking, teruma is something different. We've been talking about the grain that's set aside for the priest, and if it comes into contact, for example, with a Torah scroll, it will be disqualified as teruma. But generally speaking, if a food is dry, it is not prepared to receive tumah, and it remains pure even if it comes into contact with tumah. In order to be rendered prepared to receive impurity or susceptible to impurity, so a food has to come into contact with one of 7 biblically mandated liquids. And the 7 liquids are, actually I don't think I have a list here, because it's not what we're learning here right now, but generally speaking, those 7 liquids are, if I can remember, it's water and dew, which are separate, wine, oil, honey, blood. I got 6 of them. You can look it up. I can't remember the 7th one at this moment, okay? But the point is, if you come into contact with one of these 7 liquids, and maybe juice is actually the 7th one, because that's what is relevant here. So then the food is prepared to receive tumah and is susceptible to becoming impure. What's interesting about this, so the grapes that are in the basket, right, they come into contact with the juice that was squeezed out of the grapes. So doesn't that automatically render those grapes susceptible to tumah? And here we encounter something that's a little bit similar to a principle we didn't discuss on yesterday's daf, but which was there with regard to drawn water, and whether drawn water can invalidate a mikvah by completing the minimum measure of that ritual bath. And it's drawn water that would invalidate it, right? If you dump enough drawn water into a mikvah that has just about the minimum measure of 40 sa, a volume measure, so it invalidates the mikvah. So then the question is, well, what is drawn water? And it's interesting because if I take a bucket into a well and pull water out of it, or I put a bucket in my sink and open the faucet and collect water in the bucket, so for sure that's drawn water. But if I leave a bucket under a rain gutter by mistake, I didn't intend to collect water there. In fact, maybe it wasn't even under the gutter, but somehow it got moved, like just somebody was walking by just to get the bucket out of the path where they were walking. They repositioned it to the side of the path and it ended up collecting water. So it was totally accidental. So then the water that goes into that bucket is not considered drawn water because the intent was not there. And likewise here, the liquid that seeps out of the grapes might not be considered liquid that would prepare the grapes for tumah, because that liquid wasn't gathered with intent to gather, right? It was just accidental. It was incidental that a little bit of liquid pressed out of the grapes and then came into contact with the grapes. Likewise, if you look at a slaughterhouse, right, where cows are being slaughtered and butchered, there's blood all over the place. Blood is one of the liquids that renders a food susceptible to impurity. So what does that mean? That all meat is already prepared? Like it doesn't need further contact with liquid. When it was slaughtered, blood came into contact with the meat, but that blood is incidental to the slaughter. It wasn't gathered for any purpose. In fact, the blood in a slaughterhouse is a problem. It's a waste product that they need to get rid of. No one's keeping it for any reason. They got to get rid of it. So if it is not prepared, if there's no intent, then it can't render the food susceptible. But in this case, of the juice that gets squeezed out of those grapes in the basket when grapes are gathered for the harvest, our sages decreed that it does render them susceptible because that liquid is of use to the owner of the vineyard, right? I mean, that liquid is going to eventually go into the wine press, and the fact that a little bit comes out earlier, I don't own a vineyard, but the sages, researched it, and that little bit of liquid has a utility to the owner of the grapes. Maybe, he'd rather not lose it. Even if he doesn't care to keep it, it could be useful to him. There is a utility to it. He knows it's going to happen when he puts the grapes in the baskets. Therefore, the sages decreed that liquid does make the grapes susceptible to tumah, and therefore, the people who own the vineyard have to be careful if they want to keep those grapes and the product that comes out of it, the wine. They want to make sure that it retains its pure status. They're going to have to be careful to use baskets which have not somehow come into contact with tumah, right? It's going to require an extra degree of care to keep those, to make sure that all the baskets, all the vessels that are used to gather the grapes are in a state of ritual purity, are tahor, right? In a state of tahara. And you can imagine that that's an extra cost, right? Just like today, we know that, if you're gonna get food delivery from the supermarket during the coronavirus, right? Or your newspaper is being delivered to your front yard. I mean, all of the manufacturers who are continuing to put out products at this time and distributors who are getting those products to us, they have to use extra care, right, to make sure that they don't come into contact with something that they didn't come into contact with. That's an extra expense for anybody who's in that business. Ultimately, they're going to pass that cost on to us. They might not raise the prices yet. Eventually, they will need to. But this was something that the sages decreed. It was worth the extra expense that people understand who run a vineyard, that to keep the wine in a state of tahara, the baskets that gather the grapes are also going to have to be in a state of tahara, even though the grapes are dry. Why? Because some liquid will naturally leak out of them. That liquid has a utility, and therefore it renders the grapes prepared to receive tumah. And if they were in an impure basket, they would receive the tumah of the basket. Okay. Okay. And on that issue that we just described, Hillel said no, it would not render, that liquid that leaks out would not render the grapes prepared. And Shammai said, yes, it does. We now hold like Shammai. The halacha, the law, is according to Shammai. Usually, in almost every case, the law is according to Hillel. Why did the law go by Shammai in this case? They argued a lot. This was actually an argument between Hillel and Shammai themselves. And when they had that argument, Shammai, it was an unusual day where there were a lot more students of Shammai around, unusual circumstances. Hillel ended up being very humble and sort of taking a seat in the study hall in front of Shammai as a token of respect, even though Hillel was the Nasi, the head of the Sanhedrin, right, the highest court in the land. Another reason why rulings should go by Hillel. But that day, the ruling went by Shammai. The fact that Hillel was sort of humbled, he was always willing to be humble. He was a humble person, even though he was maybe one of the greatest Torah luminaries we've ever had. But it was not considered a good day for the Jewish people when the leader, the Nasi of the Sanhedrin, had to step down, as it were, and play the part of a student before a teacher, before his disputant, Shammai. It happened. We accept that ruling. The people didn't accept the ruling that day, but eventually it was one of those 18 decrees after their deaths in the late Second Temple period that were determined in that attic of Hananiah ben Hizkiah. Another decree from those 18 decrees. Let's say that you're walking on Friday afternoon, you're headed toward your Shabbos destination, but you didn't get there yet. You're still walking, and you're carrying a money bag, right? So that money bag is something you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos. In fact, you're not allowed to carry anything unless there's an Erev, but carrying money in particular is something that you're not allowed to carry on Shabbos. But you didn't get to your destination, and it grew dark on you. So Shabbos began. You're in Shabbos, you're on the road, and you're carrying a money bag. What do you do? According to Torah law, it had been permissible to, we have a law against carrying on Shabbos, which is you cannot carry an item, you cannot, as we discussed, pick it up, carry it, and put it down more than 4 amos. Okay, 4 cubits. 4 cubits is about 6 feet. This is what I was saying. There is a measure of 6 feet that matters to us today. So according to Torah law, it might have been possible, because you don't want to abandon the money bag. I mean, that's a thing of value, of real value. So what would you do? What you could do is stop where you are, right? And then walk a little less than 6 feet, a little less than the 4 cubits, and put it down. Stop. Right? Pick it up, move it forward a little less than the 6 feet, put it down. And so that way you never lifted, carried, and placed more than 6 feet at a time. And in those increments, you could slowly make your way to a place where you could settle in for Shabbos. But our sages, as one of these 18 decrees of our Mishna, said, no, you can't do that. So if you can't abandon the money bag, you need to get lucky and have a non-Jew who's accompanying you or is nearby, who's willing to do you a favor. And you can't ask a non-Jew to do something that is prohibited for you to do. You can't ask them to do it. But presumably you could say, oh, I have a problem. I'm a Jew. I can't, now it's Shabbat, I can't carry my money bag in a public space, and I'm just stuck here, and I guess my money's going to be lost unless somebody was able to carry it for me to my destination. And if a non-Jew was present and willing and would help you, then he could carry that money bag for you, because these restrictions only apply to Jews and not to non-Jews. And finally, these decrees end up with a sort of group of decrees. It was unclear whether they all count as one of the 18 or 2 of the 18 or more of the 18, because there's different ways to count those 18 decrees. But the bottom line is that our sages decreed that for a Jew, it's prohibited to eat the bread of non-Jews Now, this specifically means like that non-Jews bake bread for themselves, not like they're in a business of selling bread. That might be that might be a little different, might be prohibited, might not, depends on certain conditions. But generally speaking, a Jew was prohibited, according to this decree, from eating the bread of non-Jews and drinking the wine of non-Jews and eating the oil of non-Jews and marrying the daughters of non-Jews. Now, the one that specifically sort of started this series was the wine, right? So the prohibition on drinking the wine of non-Jews goes all the way back to the Torah, and we understand it because wine was used as a libation in worshiping pagan gods, right? So we only worship the one God. We don't want to take a chance in drinking wine that might have been manufactured for the purpose of, or that might have even been used. Some of the wine that ended up in this bottle was part of a batch, right, where some wine was poured onto an idol as part of pagan worship. And so then that wine that was used for Avodah Zarah, we don't want to have anything to do with it. And just to make sure that that doesn't happen, so then it became prohibited for Jews to have wine that even had a risk, any risk at all, any chance that it could have been used as a libation for a pagan deity. But even if that possibility does not exist, right, that you see your non-Jewish friend, he owns the vineyard next door, he grew the wine, you saw the whole process. There was never a chance that any wine that ended up in the bottle could have at some point been used for libation, for Avodah Zarah, for idolatry. Nevertheless, our sages decreed you can't have the wine of a non-Jew. Why? Because it leads to familiarity, right? It leads to familiarity, and familiarity leads to Jews marrying non-Jews, which is strictly prohibited. Now here you have to understand, I know that we have a lot of non-Jews in our audience, and I love you, and I'm so glad that you're here and learning with us. And I know that we have a lot of Jews in our audience who are like, sometimes I get frustrated that Jews seem to be arrogant, and when you talk about like the Jews are not allowed to marry non-Jews, how can you say that? It's offensive, it's racist. It's not offensive, it is not racist, and it is thousands of year old policy from our sages for one simple reason, that if Jews marry non-Jews, eventually there won't be Jews. So it's just that simple. And it goes back to Torah prohibitions that, by Torah law, a Jew is supposed to marry a Jew, and then the children raise Jewish. If there's other outcomes, then, that is not what is dictated for the life of Jews in the Torah. So if the rabbis are creating policy for the Jewish people to live a Jewish life within a Torah understanding of what Jewish life is, so they created policies that would lead Jews to marry Jews and not to marry non-Jews. Has nothing to do, with arrogance or we're chosen, we think we're better. It's not that. It's simply that Jews should marry Jews so there's more Jews in the world, right? And it's a very small people compared to the world population. And if Jews don't do that, then there's danger, real danger, that the world will run out of Jews. And the world needs Jews, just like the world needs, what's the word I'm looking for? Eskimos, and the world needs Pakistanis, and the world needs Libyans, and the world needs French people. The world needs to have different groups. We celebrate diversity, but Jews could be especially vulnerable because it's not easy to be a Jew. It's a lot of work to be a Jew, all your life to be a Jew, and people wander off, and then they intermarry, and then the children are not raised Jewish, and then it's like those children are lost to the community of Judaism and Jewish practice. So that's why that decree was passed. And that brings us to the end of the fourth Mishnah, and we begin a new Mishnah here on page 17. We won't get into the Gemara, the commentary on that Mishnah, but the new Mishnah discusses activities that we don't want to begin right before. We've talked a little bit about this before, but now it's adding to it. We don't want to do these activities right before Shabbat because they will create work during Shabbat, right? So that this is another dispute between Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. So Beis Shammai say that you wouldn't put certain plants into a vat because you want to extract dye out of them to make ink. Or you wouldn't put plants into that vat because you want to soften them in order to make a textile. You wouldn't put hides in the tannery because then that work is going to be going on during Shabbat. You would only do these things if there was enough time before Shabbat set in for the most significant part of that work to happen before Shabbat started. You wouldn't hand clothing to the non-Jewish launderer if the non-Jewish launderer didn't have enough time before Shabbat began to do that laundry. Because if you handed him those clothes, right before Shabbat began, and then he was naturally going to go off and do the work, and it's like you gave him work to do during Shabbat, it's like you're responsible, you violated Shabbat by giving him that work. That's all according to the opinion of Beis Shammai. Beis Hillel rule that you can do those things. You can put the plants in the vat to extract the dye, to extract the ink, to render them ready to become a textile, give clothing to the launderer, etc. And the law follows Hillel, that you can do these things. You have to be careful, but it's this law that we follow Hillel that allows us to have cholent, right? So what is cholent? Cholent is sort of like a beef stew, very traditional Eastern European Jewish food, that the meat is browned and mostly cooked, along with, often barley, potatoes, some other vegetables. It goes into some kind of a crock pot or a pot on a slow burner. It has to be, somewhat cooked before Shabbat begins, and then it can continue cooking during Shabbat, right? So a lot of the cooking already happened before Shabbat, but it does continue cooking Shabbat. But you did not do that work, right? You did work before Shabbat began to brown the meat, to get it in the pot, to get it all ready. And then you have to be extra cautious that you would not come to adjust the flame or the temperature, right? If you're using a crock pot, you're actually supposed to render it so that if it only has one setting, that's better. If it has a high and a low setting, you're actually supposed to somehow like tape that over or render it so that there's no chance you might come along and adjust the temperature during Shabbat. But you can begin that process before Shabbat. So that's the Mishna that we've just opened up, and we'll continue with God's help tomorrow when we continue our discussion. Now, let me see if there are some questions or for me to look at. Here we go. Not seeing questions. Okay, I don't think there's questions. Very good. Okay, and I'll just pause a little longer, right? Because it takes about 12 seconds for you to hear what I'm saying, sometimes more, and then to come up with a question or a comment. So I'm just babbling a little to give people a chance if they want to ask something. But at any rate, if we think about our takeaway from today, we've been looking at these enactments, these decrees that come from the sages, and they're always thinking about, what are we intending to do with this decree? What will be the unintended consequences of passing such a law? Is that something that we really want? If there is an unintended consequence, but does the original intent trump? Does it overcome the problems presented by that unintended consequence or not? And so in these cases of prohibiting a Jew, and halakhically, these are still the law. Let me just read a little bit about that. Here, halakha, and they issued a decree prohibiting their wine. So a Jew is forbidden to drink the wine of Gentiles, even if there is no concern that it might have been poured as a libation for idolatry. This ruling is in order to discourage familiarity. This applies specifically to wine fit for use as a libation for idolatry, since there is no element of idolatry connected to other alcoholic beverages. They were not included in this particular decree. but they did issue decrees on the bread as well, and specifically on the daughters, which follows. It almost didn't need a decree, but they issued that specific decree that Jews should not intermarry. It's decreed. We know that, and there's actually a decree about it as well. And Jews marrying Jews is what leads to more Jews. Now, it's important to note that if a person is born not Jewish, decides to become a Jew, goes through the full and proper procedure to convert into Judaism, then that person is indistinguishable from a Jew who was born a Jew. You're in every way. And in fact, it's prohibited by the sages to remind the convert that he is a convert, or ask questions about him as a convert, or to tell other people, well, here's my friend the convert. You don't do that, it's illegal and inappropriate. So it's really not about a prohibition on people. It's just a decree meant to encourage Jews to marry Jews and create more Jews in the world so that there's more Judaism in the world. Why is that important? Because everyone has a part to play in the human symphony, and right now, our part, both as Jews and as non-Jews joining this community, but together we are Torah learners, and we are doing our part, and we can just add a prayer. If you'll join me, please, God, help us all in the world get the message of this plague and get the message and acknowledge you and cry out to you and thank you for all the blessings in our lives without need for it to get worse. May it pass speedily and easily, and all of the harm that's already been created, may it be cut off. May you send brilliant people who solve this crisis and come up with a vaccine and a cure, and it should happen soon, and we should learn our lessons without hardship. And let's say, Amen.